Today we're going to work on collective behavior, social movements, and technology. We'll see how far we get through this very dense subject and chapter, but I think one of the things that's so wonderful about this chapter and finishing up with it is that it's so relevant to what is going on today. Think about this: collective behavior and social movements. And you will understand so much more when we're through and when you've read the chapter, that type of thing, about what types of collective behavior. We've seen so much of it lately, and you're going to see how this relates. I was just chuckling as I was writing the lecture notes about how we have examples for almost everything here that we've seen so recently. Last summer, the Black Lives Matter, then the January 6th situation. So you'll understand the origins and the motivations and all of that a lot more after we get through this. So what is social change? Because all of these things we're talking about, collective behavior, social movements, technology, in what they do is they create social change in one way or another, for good or ill, etc. So what social change is the transformation of societies and social institutions over time. And some of it is quite short-lived, as you'll see when we get into fads and things like that. But other kinds of social change, particularly those that have come about through social movements, have very lasting effects. And we'll go through those too and see what some examples are. And then certainly technology can play a role in sparking social change, both in the way we live our lives, in resistance to it potentially, um, and the incredible effects it has on our personal lives, our privacy, our children, brain development. Just you could go on with technology and the kind of change that it brings about. So we're going to explore collective behavior first. And the definition of collective behavior is the spontaneous and unstructured behavior of a large number of people, this includes all kinds of collective behavior, includes riots, fads, fashion, panic, rumors, response to disasters, etc., etc. Those are all examples of collective behavior. Okay. Now, there's two very important characteristics of collective behavior. The first one is that it's an act. It's behavior. It's not a state of mind. You may have a state of mind, fear or panic, etc., that leads to behavior, but the idea about collective behavior is that it's exactly that. It's an act, not rather than a state of mind. So as I said before, you might feel panic during a tornado, but collective behavior is when you act with many other people to get out of the way of the tornado. You get in your car and you go somewhere or you all go in your basements if you live in the Midwest, or, that type of thing. So the second characteristic of collective behavior is that it varies in its degree and in the degree of spontaneity, and also in structure. So we're going to look through a few here. The first, panic, is the least structured form, and it's, thank heavens, the shortest lived form, because it's responding to something immediately that there is panic involved with. Fads are more structured, and they could last several years. They're usually planned, often by marketing, and they could be expensive. You might have to buy them. That's why fads are started by marketing and advertising so often. And then other forms of collective behavior can become highly institutionalized. So if you think about pro-life, anti-abortion movements, that's a form of collective behavior that has become institutionalized. And then what happens when collective behavior becomes institutionalized, then they become social movements. And they have staffs and budgets and offices and lobbying and, direct mail, all those things we associate with those sorts of organizations. So why does collective behavior occur? And as I mentioned, we have seen some pretty powerful examples of collective behavior, the last being January 6th, that was, kind of, I think, woke us all up to the potential downside, what can happen when collective behavior gets particularly out of control. So there's 4 theories about why people behave the way we saw on January 6th, or why people behaved protesting with Black Lives Matter. Okay, different behaviors, but the theories behind them are what is the impetus for people to be involved in those things. So the 4 theories are the contagion theory. You can tell by the word kind of where that one's going, contagious behavior. Convergence theory, and you can tell by that word it's when things come together, right? Emergent norms, that's new norms that are beginning to appear in a culture or a society. And this one's very interesting too, the structural strain theory. Now, so what that means is that within the actual form or structure of society, there are major strains that are occurring that people are responding to through collective behavior. And so each of those theories has its strengths and weaknesses. You'll see as we go through this that often more than one applies to a particular situation. However, most theorists that are affiliated and feel strongly about, most social scientists, one of those theories over, they tend to just apply that one theory to things. But we're free to think about, well, there's a bit of contagion here, there's a bit of emergent norms here, that type of thing. So first we're going to look at the contagion theory. And this is pretty much the oldest theory of collective behavior. And what it says is that individuals act emotionally and irrationally due to a crowd, the almost hypnotic influence of a crowd, that being in a crowd, in other words, can actually change your behavior through picking up contagiously on the behavior of people in the crowd. Okay. In other words, you do things you wouldn't normally do, right? Because of the contagion theory. So that was the French scholar Le Bon. And he asserted that people in crowds, particularly mobs and riots, okay, here we're looking at current events, undergo a radical transformation. Secondly, that the anonymity of the crowd, the feeling of power, the infectious mob mind, that's the contagion, that infectious mob mind, emboldens people to abandon their personal responsibility and to engage in antisocial behavior and often violent behavior that they normally would never engage in. Now, some of those people on January 6th would normally engage in violent behavior. It was kind of their MO. But I would guess that the majority of that crowd, that's not their modus operandi, normally, the violence. But the hypnosis of the mob mind kind of got to them. And then another sociologist, an American sociologist, he later refined that theory that Le Bon had first promulgated, the contagion theory. And what he emphasized was the milling of a crowd, that people moving around and talking to each other and becoming increasingly excited, That's was what the basis of the contagion is. And it produces what he called a circular reaction in which the participants become more intense and unified in attacking a target. Okay, now isn't that kind of right on? And because they feel anonymous in this large crowd, then they abandon self-control. So that's the contagion theory. Now we're going to move to the convergence theory. Now, we're going to go back to the contagion theory for a moment to contrast and compare where the impulse for the behavior comes from, because they're kind of opposite. So once again, the contagion theory says that crowds are highly suggestible and out of control. But what the convergence theory says, in contrast to that, it says that crowds consist already, the fact that they're there together as a crowd, they are like-minded people who deliberately assemble in a place to pursue a common goal. I want you to think of January 6th again. What was the common goal of like-minded people? To, quote, stop the steal by any means required. They felt were required. So with the convergence theory, what happens is collective behavior occurs when people who share similar values, think about QAnon, think about the belief, values, beliefs that the election was stolen as a belief, attitudes, emotions, and goals, when they converge, people who share those things in common, when they converge on a particular location, that's the beginning of this convergence theory. They all believe the same things. They all feel the same way. They all have the same goals, and they're all together in a particular place. So, therefore, with the convergence theory, instead of the crowd affecting the individuals as in the contagion theory, it's the opposite. It's the individuals in the crowd that affect the crowd from the convergence theory perspective. So examples are marches, rallies, acts of civil disobedience that oppose governments or foreign domestic policy. So that convergence theory works, perfectly for civil rights movements, Black Lives Matter, the women's movement, that type of thing. Now, here is the third theory, the emergent norm theory. Emergent means it's coming to the fore, it's becoming prevalent or obvious. A norm, is a rule or a standard of what's right and wrong, basically. So these are emerging norms, the emergent norm behavior. And what that theory says is that social norms shape crowd behavior. So if a situation is unusual, which a crowd or a group of people coming to a particular place to do something, normal rules don't apply, do they? I refer you back to January 6th. That was not normal behavior, either in terms of social norms or in terms of legal norms. Okay? Those all got blown away because what happened was they created their own norms. The emerging norms of that particular situation. So the crowd creates rules that guide behavior in what they perceive as rational ways. So part of what happens is there's, the most committed types and this is actually more relevant to, once again, to social movements than to riots or mobs. So maybe I should have used a different example, but it's true that as different norms emerge, different behavior occurs. It's just this is a slightly different context in that you'll see what these norms typically are. So the most committed types in a particular movement or idea of emerging norms, they emerge as leaders. They become the leaders. And in these situations, people who have who disagree or have a different agenda, like looting, for instance. Let's think of Black Lives Matter again. Those people are typically ignored because the movement, I mean, the behavior, the collective behavior, the demonstrations, the marches are about supporting these emergent norms that people, whether that's justice or whatever it is. So in effect, in the emergent norm theory, people aren't spontaneously, quote, infected with the emotions of others, as in the contagion theory. Instead, what happens with the emergent norm theory is that the crowd develops norms as the situation unfolds. So seeing how it goes in whatever situation you are marching, protesting, etc. So for example, as they point out, the example was a union might strike. But in the case, and it's so often the case, and this is happening right now too, this example in the country with many healthcare workers and nursing home workers trying to unionize and or strike. And so, but if the negotiations you can't reach agreement, then the strike becomes more intense, right? Then you up the ante a bit. And then you develop norms that might involve boycotts or sit-ins or a variety of things of that nature. So the norms emerge during the actual demonstration or march or process, okay? That's the emergent norms theory. The structural strain theory, and this is also called the value added theory, which is interesting to think about, isn't it, to call it that? And what that theory says is that collective behavior occurs only if 6 particular conditions are present. The conditions are value added because each subsequent one, and we'll go through the 6, each subsequent one leads to the next and builds upon the next one. From 1 to 6. And so that adds value to each norm. You get all 6 and then you get the behavior. So the first one is the first step in the structural strain theory is called structural conduciveness. What does that mean? It means that the existing social conditions foster or encourage collective behavior. So when other channels aren't open to people to express a grievance, or their grievances are ignored, then that leads to the next step. This is how the Black Lives Matter and other social movements started, okay, from the social strain theory. So there's a problem, right? And there's no response from the powers that be to your grievances, okay? Or they're ignored. Well, that's no response, right? Or there's no pathway, no legitimate pathway to bring your grievances to the fore. So that's the structural conduciveness. The second step is structural strain. So the strain could be war, but it can also be discrimination, poverty, injustice, etc., okay? And those conditions make people angry. They make them frustrated, or they interfere with their lives. So this is where Black Lives Matter, once again, or the women's movement. Those issues interfere directly with people's lives. They're life and death issues. Okay? The third step in this structural strain theory is the growth and spread of a generalized belief state. So when people then see that problem, the problem that's being ignored or has no pathway to bring a legal case or whatever against it, when people start seeing the situation as a widespread problem instead of a personal fault, this is a key point. In other words, it's a problem with the structure of society, not the individual. When people start viewing whatever the problem is that way, then it's become, the problem has become institutionalized. It's taken out of the individual and the personal. This is the sociological perspective, and it begins to be part of the structure of society. People begin to view it as built in. The poverty isn't widespread because people are lazy. It's because there's an unjust economic system going on. Okay. Step 4 is what's called precipitating factors. There are incidents or events that trigger action. I take you back to Black Lives Matter, okay, or to the women's right to vote, or other rights. Then the 5th stage is the mobilization for action stage. This is where leaders emerge, the the Vietnam War, the peace movement. Those are all examples of this. So in the 5th step, the leaders begin to emerge. And the 6th is the social control stage. As I wrote in my notes, the name says it all, social control stage. Now you get the pushback from the powers that be, from the police, from the militia, from the authorities, from, whatever. This is where the pushback comes. The opposing groups, and those are often institutionalized groups like those I just mentioned, the law, the courts, whatever, they interrupt or repress those advocating for social change. Now, I hope that really helps you understand what has been happening and what some of the reasons for what has been happening is happening. Okay. So now we're going to look at different types of collective behavior. Then rumors and is the first one we're going to talk about, rumors. So I put in parentheses conspiracy theories after that because that's what rumors are often. And here's the definition of what a rumor or a conspiracy theory is: unfounded information that people spread quickly. Some are much more harmful than others. Oh, isn't that true? And how much more quickly that type of thing spreads today. And this is where we get into some of the downsides of technology, the ease with which disinformation spreads. And we'll get into disinformation and propaganda, but rumors spread and conspiracy theories. So the example I give you in the book is January 1st, Y2K. Most of you, or many of you, are too young to have either remembered or been born then, but oh my heavens, it was so many people were just getting hysterical about this because all the operating systems in the world were going to crash when we flipped out of the 1900s, and the computers wouldn't know how to handle it. All the lights would go out. There were going to be global power outages. The banks would all have to close because you couldn't get your money because the computers wouldn't work. Airplanes were going to fall from the skies, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not kidding. That's what a lot of people thought. And it's because of the internet, it spread to millions and millions of people in seconds. And it incited riots and panic in different, not just in the US, it's spread all over the world, and incredible anxiety, even if you were not rioting and panicking, which was not that huge deal then, but certainly widespread anxiety was. So people built underground shelters and hoarded bottled water, we've been through that recently, and food, etc. Most rumors are harmless. Things like Elvis still being alive or John Lennon still being alive. They don't really hurt anybody, those types of rumors, but others can be very, very damaging. And we've seen that recently as well. They not only can damage human individuals, they can damage whole systems of democracy and things of that nature. So the key about rumors is typically they're false. That's why they're called rumors or conspiracy theories. Why do so many people believe them? It's really, really an interesting subject. to delve into that. I have been thinking and writing about that a lot lately. Why do people believe them? Because some people just simply doesn't do it for them. I'm one of those people. I'm going, are you kidding me? Just use a teeny bit of critical thinking and you'll see how silly all of it can be. So many of these rumors. But people deeply, I'm sure you're aware, do believe in them. And why? Well, first, from a sociological perspective, those rumors often relate to an important subject, okay? So, and that's true today with COVID and economic stuff and elections and all of those things. So during uncertain economic times or political times, natural disasters, people are already anxious and stressed. So that's the first one. Second, often there's little factual information to counter the rumor. And I would say that the second piece of this is more accurate. There's plenty of factual information, always, particularly in this day and age. You just have to know which are valid sources and which aren't, which goes back to the original comment I made about critical thinking and knowing how to do, and knowing even a little bit about how to do research and valid research. But so the second point is, after it says there's little factual information, which I completely disagree with, it says more usually people distrust the sources of the information. And that's the key point, okay? Because once again, if you know what are valid sources of information, how the information was gathered, what research has been done, and you know how it hasn't been done, then you know which source to trust. Okay, so once again, to go back to Y2K, all these people who were panicking, just simply didn't believe the computer scientists who were saying, hey, we got this. We've programmed the computers. They can handle a flip over from, 1999 to 2000. They're computers, and we programmed them for that. So computer scientists, federal agencies, all assured everybody that a calamity would not occur, that the rollover would be pretty smooth, which it was completely smooth as it turned out. But many, many, many people just didn't believe that. The third point about rumors is that they're entertainment, they're diversion, they're drama, and people love all of those things. So, and especially in a situation like a lockdown, more or less a lockdown, I hate to use that terminology, I shouldn't say that, where people are more isolated during COVID. They're home more, they're on their computers more, right? So that drama and that gossip is kind of makes you feel alive or interested, at least. And so then the next two we're going to look, that's rumors. The next two we're going to look at is gossip and urban legends. So gossip are rumors, but they're not as intense as what we studied about, before. They're part of this whole rumor thing. They're very often negative. Gossiping usually does not have a positive connotation, does it? And they're usually about other people's personal lives. I love the quote in the text, no one gossips about other people's virtues. Isn't that a great quote? That is so true. So because it's usually derogatory, it makes the people doing the gossiping feel superior. Sometimes it's used to control other people's behavior and to reinforce community standards. So comments about someone's drug abuse or sexual behavior, it strengthens the norms. It makes them the outgroup, the people you're gossiping about with their nasty drug behavior and sexual behavior. And we're now the good people, the in-group, following the norms. And so it strengthens norms about what is deviant behavior. That's another aspect or function, if you will, of gossip. And the third aspect of gossip is that it's very often based on resentment or envy of someone else's appearance or accomplishments or things of that nature. I'm sure we're all familiar with this, either on the receiving end or the giving end of gossip. So, what are urban legends? They're another form of rumor. And there are rumors about stories that supposedly happened somewhere, sometime. They're often funny or horrifying or odd. They're usually pretty extreme. So that human finger in Wendy's hamburger that created such, someone said they had found a human finger on a Wendy's hamburger, created huge panic. Wendy's lost millions and millions of dollars, et cetera. That was an example of an urban legend. President Obama not being born in the United States is another one. There are many, many health-related urban legends. Your book goes into that around vaccines and other things. So why do urban legends persist so much longer than gossip? Because the thing about gossip is it's quickly comes and goes. Urban legends tend to, go round and round and round, sometimes for years, escalate, etc. Well, one of the reasons they persist much longer than gossip is that they are reflecting contemporary anxieties and fears. Second, they're cautionary tales. They're warning us to watch out in a dangerous world. Third, we tend to believe them because we hear them from people we trust, and often and especially our family members. And fourth, to reject slanted information outright is hard work. I mentioned this a minute ago. It requires critical thinking. It requires peeling the onion, as we say in sociology. Go down layers, go down some different routes, listen to find out where that information is coming from. What kind of research was done to tell you these things, okay? So it is hard, and it's particularly hard if it's a family member telling you this, right? There's some subtle dances that have to be done with that, both in your head to take the time and energy to figure out what's actually going on, and to keep relationships with friends or family okay, but not buy into it. So that's the fourth reason, because rejecting slanted information outright is hard work. Okay, now we're going to look at panic and mass hysteria. So panic is, remember, this is all under the title or heading of collective behavior. Okay, so panic and mass hysteria. Panic is a collective flight, often irrational, from a real or perceived danger. Mass hysteria, on the other hand, is an intense, fearful, and anxious reaction to a real or imagined threat by larger numbers of people. So, panic is a smaller number of people. Mass hysteria, the term mass tells you that it's a much larger group of people. So what drives panic? Fear drives panic. The danger seems overwhelming. And often, this is in a real case, once again, people trying to escape. We saw that in Oregon with people trying to escape fires and, being on the road for, in traffic jams of people trying to leave certain areas. We've seen that in California as well. There is real danger. And when there is real danger, your adrenaline gets going and you tend to panic, and then you get in. Often the panic causes more of a difficult situation, like the traffic jams and things of that nature, leaving an area. And in those cases, people often, they jam escape routes, as I just said, leap from high buildings, or jump off of ships. During the stock market crash in, before the Great Depression, not the 2008 one, the one that happened in the 1930s, 29, people sold off their stocks like crazy. And had they just held on a little bit, it would have been better. Now that's panic. So mass hysteria, they used the 2009 H1N1 flu, the swine flu, people were hysterical all around the world. It never materialized. And the thing about mass hysteria is that they tend to last longer because there are warnings that are coming from legitimate sources that are anticipating. What people always forget to hear is the possibility of something happening. And those warnings are often about our food source, or health, and that just reinforces people's generalized fears about life's dangers and life's anxieties. Fashions and fads, I'm not going to go into that deeply. I'm sure you're aware they only last a short period of time. But what about disasters? Well, disasters are unexpected events that cause widespread damage, destruction, distress, and loss. So there's categories of causes for disasters. Some simply cannot be helped, others can. So social causes could be mitigated. They come from dysfunctional social situations. So social causes are war, genocide, terrorist attacks, and civil strife. Okay, we've been seeing civil strife lately in America, as an example. I'm sure you're familiar with war and genocide. Okay. There are technological causes. So those are things like oil spills and nuclear accidents, burst dams, building collapses. Texas is an example of a technological cause. It's also a social cause because of the laws in Texas around energy. But it involved social causes, technological causes with burst pipes and things of that nature, and it also involved the third one, which is the precipitating factor, natural causes, which was the freeze. So natural causes are floods, landslides, earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunami, dramatic shift in the climate really quickly, like we saw in Texas with freezing, etc. And then the other thing to understand, so those causes are social, technological, and natural, the three different kinds. Now, disasters generally, not always, but generally, inspire organized behavior rather than just chaos. And I say usually because that's not always true. But what they mean by that is, by the organized behavior, is that systems come in to support people in times of disaster, usually, and sometimes more functionally and effectively than others. So because of that, instead of panicking, most people during a disaster are rational, cooperative, altruistic. They care for family members, people volunteer, that type of thing. Once again, when we think about the fires, all the people who helped people and found housing for them, and are volunteering actually to clear housing sites where houses need to be rebuilt, and a variety of other things. That's what they mean by altruistic behavior and volunteering in disasters. So now we're going to look at public opinion and propaganda, which could not be more relevant to our time. So what is the public? A public is a group of people that are not necessarily in direct contact with each other, but who are interested in a particular issue. So there are many public issues: abortion, gun control, pollution, climate change, healthcare, same-sex marriage, et cetera, et cetera. We can go on and on and on. Those are all examples of publics that are affiliated or associated or feel strongly about one of those issues or more. So interaction with as a public is often indirect. There's a lot of people who agree with you, pro-life or anti-abortion, but you don't know them all personally, right? But you all are a public in that arena, or let's take gun control or a variety of other things. Okay, so that's often an indirect, not face-to-face connection, but through mass media and social media and blogs and professional journals, etc. That's how people tend to connect about those things. The public in those around different areas or issues, I should say, are not necessarily organized groups with memberships. They're often transitory. They come and go. They expand or contract as people gain or lose interest in an issue. So now we're going to see how some of that does get institutionalized in a few minutes. So don't think that your text and I are not aware of the fact that they do often become institutionalized, but we'll look at that in a minute. So public opinion is the next thing we're looking at. It's widespread attitudes on a particular issue, and there's three components to public opinion. The first is it's a verbalization rather than an action. It's talking, right? Opinion. You're not marching in this situation with public opinion. It's communication, okay? It's a verbalization. Verbalization can also be, verbalization, as you know, actually means speaking, but it can also be done through writing and that type of thing. Two, it's about a matter that concerns a lot of people. Think about those subjects, abortion, gun control, etc., whatever. And three, it involves a controversial issue, as those examples all do. And so interests and opinions change over time about various issues, depending on what's going on in a society at a particular time in history. Now, that's public opinion. What's propaganda? Propaganda is spreading information or misinformation more often to influence people's attitudes or behavior. I say more often because in the current world, that's exactly what's happening. Propaganda can be positive, in a sense. It's spreading. Here the definition: spreading information. Okay, well, if it's valid and accurate information, okay. Or misinformation to influence people's behavior and attitudes. So it isn't a collective behavior in and of itself, but it affects collective behavior in very important ways. First, it can create attitudes that arouses collective outbursts like strikes and riots. As we go through this, you can think about also the propaganda about Jews in pre-World War II Germany under Hitler's, rule. So first, it can create attitudes that arouses collective outbursts, so like strikes and riots. Second, it can try to prevent collective outbursts. For example, if they give you corporations try to convince workers that layoffs are due to a weak economy, right, and not to offshoring and technologizing jobs, that type of thing. Oh no, it's a weak economy. Okay. Third, it tries to gain followers for a cause. That's one of the things propaganda, always factual or not, tries to gain followers for a cause. Fourth, propaganda is institutionalized in advertising, political campaigns, government policies in many ways, mass media, political speeches, religious groups, rumors, symbols, flags, bumper stickers are all come under the umbrella of propaganda. So now we're going to look at crowds. Crowds are a temporary gathering of people who share a common interest or participate in a common event. And they gather for a variety of causes. They differ in motives and interests and emotional levels. And there's a difference between mobs and riots. And it'll be interesting for you, I think, to think about and apply, was it a mob or a riot or a bit of both, to some of the recent things we've seen in the last year or two. So a mob is a highly emotional and disorderly crowd that uses force, the threat of force or violence against a specific target. Okay. A riot is a violent crowd that directs its hostility at a wide and shifting range of targets. Okay. So with those two definitions, we keep hearing about the riot at the Capitol, but actually a mob fits the definition a little bit better. Let me get this here. Okay, so now we're going to quickly, I hate to rush through this, but I only have so much room to put a lecture on a flash drive to upload it because of my technology, my primitive technology, and not having broadband at home. So anyway, I'll move on, but I want to get to social movements now because they're really important, and we'll get as far as we get. So, social movements, the definition, a large and organized group of people who want to promote or resist a particular social change. So, here are some examples: the abolition of slavery, the women's right to vote, the union movement, open admissions to public colleges. Student aid came about because of a result of a social movement. Head Start, the peace movement, the end of the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and Black Lives Matter is a current example. All of those, they all came about through social movements, which are goal-oriented, deliberate, structured, and obviously from those examples can have very lasting impact on society. So in contrast to other forms of collective behavior that we just explored, people in social movements are dispersed over time and space. There's not necessarily a lot of face-to-face interaction until there's a march or a demonstration or something of that nature. Some, like white supremacists, this is material from 2014, so this is interesting to see some of the changes just in that short period of time, because they're saying some, like white supremacists, are relatively small. Now that's true. They're still relatively, in terms of the whole 333 million people in the United States, relatively small. But the whole awareness of it has changed, and they have grown dramatically. So others are very large social movements, and they actually have subgroups. They're so large. So if you look at the environmental movement in the United States, there's at least 50 subgroups. They just mentioned a few: Earth First, Greenpeace, the Audubon Society, the Union of Concerned Scientists, et cetera, till you get to 50. Okay. So what are the different types of social movements? There are 5 different types of social movements. There are alternative social movements where the goal is to change people's attitudes or behaviors in some specific way. And 2 examples of that are Alcoholics Anonymous and Transcendental Meditation. The second type is that's called alternative. The alternative is to change your attitude or your behavior. Okay. The second type of social movement is called redemptive. And the goal is dramatic change, yes, but only for some people. And it's usually based on spiritual, as you can tell from the redemptive terminology, spiritual or supernatural beliefs. So the examples for that are the Jehovah's Witnesses and born-again Christians. The third type of social movement is reformative. To reform something means to change it, okay? So the goal in a reformative social movement is to change everyone, but in specific ways. So, and they say specific ways, but what they really mean is about specific issues. So the example of that is gay rights, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, animal rights. Those were and are still all social movements. The fourth kind is the resistance or reactionary counter type of social moves. So the goals for that are to preserve the status quo by blocking or undoing change. There you get anti-abortion groups, because it's legal, right? Roe versus Wade, 1972, and white supremacists are the examples for this reactionary resistance to change type of social movement. And the fifth type is revolutionary. And the goals for that is that not just for particular issues, but for everyone to change. So right-wing militia groups and communism and the Islamic State are examples of revolutionary types of social movements. Why do they emerge? Why do social movements emerge? Here's a wonderful quote about that from your text. Their social movements are either an answer to a threat or a hope. So there are various theories, as you might imagine, about social movements. There are everything in sociology. So the first is the mass society theory, large society theory. And to go through the characteristics of that is that people feel powerless, insignificant, and isolated in modern societies. And I think that's very true. They're very impersonal, industrialized, and highly bureaucratized. Most people are working at jobs they don't like, that are meaningless, et cetera, et cetera. So social movements give a sense of belonging to those who feel alienated and disconnected. So that's the mass society theory. The next theory is called the relative deprivation theory. Deprivation means you're deprived of something. Relative means in comparison to others. Okay, so it's a gap between what people have and what they think they should have compared with others in society, i.e. poverty, racism, gender discrimination, all of those things. Okay. There's also two other elements in that relative behavior theory. The first is that people often feel they deserve better than what they have. And secondly, they believe they cannot attain their goals through conventional channels. The system is against them, and so you have to change the system. That's the idea of the relative deprivation theory, the motivation for people to join social movements from that perspective. Then the resource mobilization theory is that a social movement will succeed if it can mobilize an organization and leadership dedicated to advancing its cause. Now, those resources involve money, devoted volunteers, paid staff, access to the media, effective communication systems, special legal or technical knowledge and skills. You need equipment, you need a physical space in which to place this organization, and alliances with like-minded groups to strengthen affiliations, lobbyists who donate to your cause. So examples of that are gun rights and gun control movements. I would say pro-life and anti-abortion movements are also examples. So that's the resource mobilization. The more resources you can mobilize, the stronger your organization and your movement is going to be. The new social movements theory is, and that was prominent around the 1970s, where there was a huge upheavals of social movements in the United States and actually around the world. Late 60s, early 70s, the student movement, huge protests by students all around the world, particularly in Europe. France and the US were the two biggies, but lots of other places. So it emphasizes the linkages among culture, politics, and ideology. Well, those are pretty powerful three, aren't they? Culture, politics, and ideology. Those are probably the three most important components in how any society thinks and behaves. And unlike other theories, it promotes the rights of all and the welfare of all people, rather than specific groups or in particular countries. And that was what the student movement was about, promoting the rights of everyone and the welfare, the betterment of life for everyone. So these kinds of movements, the new social movements that started in the 70s, are interested in the struggle to liberate the voices of the dispossessed. Another wonderful quote from your book. So recent social movements differ from older ones in several ways in these new social movements. They attract a disproportionate number of people who are well educated and relatively affluent. They represent a wide range of professions. So there's educators, scientists, actors, business people, political leaders, etc. You see that certainly in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the environmental movement, and all of those people involved in the movement share a broad goal of improving the quality of life for all people around the world. They pursue goals or advance values that may not personally benefit the members of the movement. I saw someone speaking the other day about the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and he was saying, and he was a black man, and he was saying there were as many, if not more, white people at those demonstrations as there were black people. And he was so impressed by that. Now, it depended on what city you were in and, which particular demonstration it was. But you just look at the pictures and you can see that. Those demonstrators were not having a personal positive effect on their lives. They were there for justice for everyone, which is what the new social movements tend to be focused on. So what are the different stages of social movements? Most of them are very short-lived. They're kind of flash in the pan and then they disband. So the emergence stage is that there's got to be a number of people who are distressed about some conditions and want to change it. And then you find this is when they're first emerging. Then you find one or more individuals who become agitators and prophets and emerge as leaders. And those leaders verbalize the feelings of the rest of the group, of the rest of the people who are discontented and interested in this social movement, and they crystallize the issues and push for action. And if they don't get much support, those emergent leaders, then the movement will die. But if they do get support, then public awareness increases and the movement attracts more people. And the organization then is the second stage. Now it's emerged. Now it needs to organize. That's the second stage. So once consciousness has been raised, then organization occurs. And those members form alliances, recruit, do mass mailings, etc. Then it becomes institutionalized and it becomes more bureaucratic. There's staff positions, etc. And then eventually it declines. They almost all end eventually. There are some exceptions to that. There are still certainly civil rights issues with Black Lives Matter and women's movements. And social movements matter because many of the rights that we enjoy today came from social movements, right? I just gave you a laundry list at the beginning, many of which affect you. Financial aid for students, public admission to colleges, community colleges came from social movement, etc. So that's on the individual level. We benefit personally. On an institutional level, it changes practices and laws. So now we have organic food in almost every grocery store and labeling and, healthy food is available, farm to table, that type of thing. That changed practices, business practices, legal practices, etc. And on a society level, the major effect is on both the US and globally. So if you think about it, most of the world's religions began as social movements. And democratic governments grew from social movements. So it was a very wide range of effects. So don't be too resistant to them when you see them happening. And to wrap up this technology, basically, as they point out, there's costs, there are benefits to technology. There are also huge costs to technology, both literally in terms of dollars and figuratively in terms of what we lose. I hope we're not going to lose books, real paper books, but I think we might eventually. Children's brains, the amount of time people spend on the internet, how social media makes you feel emotionally and psychologically. Those are all downsides. The upsides are It's wonderful to be able to, for me at any rate, to Google almost anything. I remember the day of going to the library and library cards. And, you had to get in your car or walk and go to the library to find out the questions you wanted to know. Now, when I'm writing lectures, I just go to Google and say, what's the updated, rate of incarceration in the United States or something, if we're talking about criminal justice. So that's it. Thank you.